All right, welcome everybody. Let's get started. It's 1:40 and it's an amazing day. It's a beautiful day outside, right? It's so nice. It's just the kind of day that, I don't know, makes you happy to be walking to class, right? Today we're going to continue talking about the sounds of human language. We're going to wrap up our discussion from last time about how we use our bodies and our vocal tracts to make these sounds. And then we're going to start thinking about the systems of sounds that allow us to create words and and longer phrases in a specific language, and how these things are constrained and how we can model them. Last time we talked about finite state machines and their relationship to language models, right? To how we can model the strings in a language, in a natural language. We're going to see a little bit more about that if there's time, but there is something that relates to the homework assignment and these language models encoded as finite state machines that I think is really nice. So if there's no time today, we'll do it on Thursday, because then everyone will have turned in their assignments, and then we can talk about the relationship between these language models in the assignment. And then we started talking about phonetics, and that's where we're going to pick up now. If you have any questions about the assignment or anything else, now it would be a great time to bring that up. Yeah. Oh, for the people who access Copilot fine, was there anything? Can somebody describe what you did? Yeah. Yeah, so the issue, I think, is that you need to sign in with your school account because the university has a deal. So make sure you're signed in to your school account and not a personal account. But if that doesn't work, you're welcome to use the free version of ChatGPT. If you're not logged in, that's fine. Just, do just the stuff from the assignment. I wouldn't ask anybody to use a language model for anything else, especially if you're not being protected with the, according to the privacy requirements that we need to have when we use these things. So if you must use some free thing, do just the things that are in the assignment. But you should be able to use your school accounts to access Copilot. Just make sure you sign out of any personal accounts, log in with your school account. If you can't get that to work, send me a message, send me a screenshot of what you see, and we'll figure it out for you. Anything else? Yeah?
I think ChatGPT is giving like a student remote.
Yeah. So everybody has gotten this. I would classify it as spam because it's unsolicited email, right? But if you are a student at not just this university, but many large universities, you're getting contacted by OpenAI saying that you're getting free ChatGPT, like the better version. I mean, of course, it's their way to get you as a paying customer eventually. I have no advice for people on whether or not to to take them up on this deal. It's a decision that you get to make. But know that this is not endorsed by the university. This is just OpenAI trying to get you as a customer. Anything else? Nothing about the homework. Lots of people turned in the homework already. It's encouraging. The number one question I have gotten about the homework is, can I have an extension? And, and the answer to this is yes, but you should know how the extension works. It's all described in the syllabus. You don't have to ask me to use the extra time you have as described in the syllabus. No need to ask me in advance. But you should be aware of how that will affect the time you have for future homework assignment submissions. The other question that I've gotten a couple of times, so 2 different people asked me about this, and if 2 people ask me, I'm sure that there are other people facing this same issue, is that you try to run some piece of code that's in the description of the assignment, and you copy and paste, and it's something that's going to do something with the FSTs, either add a transition or load one of the files that we have linked in the assignment, something else, and then you get an error that says, and if you read the error, it says name error, so that thing is not defined. That can happen because Python doesn't know about FSTs in the way we're building them. This is all implemented in some other code that you get when you run that very first piece of code in the description of the assignment. Let me pull it up here so you can see it. Let me find the assignment. All right, so this is what you see. Let's see, where's this? So I say run these things step by step, right? So when you run this, in particular, it's this line. So this line says, get the code that I wrote, that as in me, not you, right? That will implement these FSTs. And then when you run this, then you will be able to use all the FST functionality. If you don't run this, then the things that are related to FSTs won't work. You will get that name error. So that's one issue that people run into. The other thing that can be happening is you have a typo, and you are not calling things by the right name. That will also give you that issue. Python, as with most programming languages, is very, very picky about getting every character correct in the names of things. And the other thing that can happen is that if you run this and you play around and things work, and then you close Colab, and some time passes, you open it again, and you go to the bottom of your notebook, try to pick up from there, it's like you never ran any of the other stuff. If you're in that situation, just run it from the beginning again, all the cells, and then you should be fine. All right? If you get into a situation where you can't get things to run, just send me a message, contact your TAs. Oh, and also, I won't, let you know explicitly every time I add a new question to the FAQ, but if you have an issue and you haven't checked this in a while, then go to the bottom, make sure that your question is not already answered here. And no one's posted questions on the discussion board, but please feel free. If you have a question and you think other people might have the same question, feel free to post on the discussion board. I will read and answer those. All right. Anything else about the assignment? Yeah. Very, very soon, possibly tomorrow. All right, so let's talk about phonetics. We said last time that this is about how we make speech sounds perceive, how we represent speech sounds, how we characterize speech sounds, and what these sounds are like. There's something very physical about language, right? So language is something that we create using our bodies. And this is related to what we're going to be looking at today. Last time I mentioned the idea of the phoneme, right, as this abstract category where you can have things that may not be physically identical, but we recognize as one of the sounds that we can use in a specific language. To jog your memory, I had this example of the triangles and squares here. Even though the squares are not identical to each other, and even though they are not, actually perfect, you still recognize these as squares. Also, every time I make the s sound when I'm pronouncing words, sometimes I will pronounce this differently. Sometimes it will not be a perfect s. Sometimes it will, every time it's different from every other time, but you still always recognize it as the s sound, unless something happens, I'm coughing or something, and I say it in a way that's very, very different, not recognizable. But you still recognize it's the same phoneme, right? The other thing from last time that I want to bring back to mind right now is the International Phonetic Alphabet. You have been looking at the CMU Pronouncing Dictionary that has alphabet transcriptions of English words. So you have those words, and then you have a sequence of symbols where each symbol corresponds to one of these sounds that you can use, one of these sound categories, right, that you can use to pronounce English words. Those are meant to be English specific, and they were built with very practical purposes in mind. In linguistics, we have something called the International Phonetic Alphabet, which people just refer to as IPA. And the IPA looks something like this. There are these funny symbols that represent various types of sounds. This is just a fragment of the IPA. If you want to see the whole thing, and if you want to see what these symbols actually sound like, you can go to the Canvas page for the last lecture, for lecture 6, and I have some links there, linked to the full IPA, and these are clickable links, so when you click one of the symbols, you will actually hear the pronunciation of the sound that corresponds to that symbol. Yeah?
Is there an IPA for just the letter T? Because it has to be followed by an E.
So letter is different from sound. So that's one really important thing so that's a great question, because it's a really important thing to get these things straight. So you can have a language that has no writing. And in principle, you should still be able to express the sequence of sounds that people are saying in that spoken language by using some symbols that will correspond to those sounds. So in English, it just so happens that our orthography has this approximation between the letters and the sounds. So sometimes you will think of t as the sound the letter T makes. So let's not think of letters as making sounds. Letters is just what we use to write. And when we think of these symbols, we are just thinking of these as the representation of the sound units. So in that sense, there is no one-to-one correspondence between the IPA and English orthography. Even though you may be able to find it frequently, the letter K corresponds to the sound K in the same way that some symbol that looks like the letter K is present in the IPA. But try to keep these separate, right? One thing is orthography, and the other one is sounds. And in English, like I said, sometimes these things more or less match up, but very approximately. There are languages where the writing doesn't work like that at all, and you could still transcribe the sounds that people are using. There will still be phonemes in those languages too. So don't associate phoneme with the letter. That is an excellent question. Okay, so here's where we stopped last time, right? I said that if you look at the IPA, you will see that these column headers has some words that you may not be familiar with. We're going to go through, why these words are here and what they're referring to. And here's some other words. And then, this is a table, right? So then you can say that this sound right here, you can look at what's going on here, look at what's going on here. So what is this doing? This is a way to organize the sounds according to how we produce them. And we're going to characterize sounds based on the part of the vocal tract that we are engaging to produce that sound, and how the air is flowing when you produce that sound. So we're going to have small number of features, right? Like the location and the airflow that's to describe that sound. And those small number of features can then can then describe a larger number of sounds, but still a pretty limited inventory. And then that limited inventory of sounds are the sounds that are going to be used in thousands of human languages. So those little words that I said that may not be familiar to you, or maybe they are, they actually refer to specific places in the vocal tract. So there is a link on Canvas to optional readings by week. If you go to the front page all the way in the bottom, there's a link to optional readings. If you want to know more about this, there is, you go to that page on Canvas and you go to week 4, and there's a link there to the chapter on phonetics from a free textbook, an online textbook. They will explain all this in much more detail if you're really curious about phonetics. And of course, we have a fantastic course on phonetics in the linguistics department if you want to take it. But the takeaway from this picture, which I'm not going to spend a lot of time on, is that you see that there, the lips and the palate, the roof of your mouth. There is your tongue, your teeth, this place like right here called the alveolar ridge, and this is essentially a picture of your vocal tract, your tongue, right? When we are describing these sounds, like I said, we're going to say something about which part of the vocal tract you are engaging to produce that sound. So one of the words that you might use to describe some sounds is bilabial. As the name sounds like, bilabial is something that where you're going to use both lips, right, the upper and lower lip, and this sounds like the p and the b, right? You close your lips, so you have to use both upper and lower lip to do that. Labiodental sounds, as the name implies, are the sounds that are going to involve what? Labiodental. What does that make you think of? Yeah. Yeah, lip and teeth, right? So the f and the v. Notice how that includes your lip and your teeth, right? So that's the type of description. If you look at the IPA and you look at those headings there, and you can find those places on the vocal tract, the articulators, in some diagram like this. Every linguistics textbook has a diagram like this. Then you can see how we're using those names to describe the sounds in that way. And then we can also describe some other characteristics of those sounds. Some sounds are voiced, some sounds are voiceless. Notice that for example, the f and the v, they seem so similar, right? Because when I move my lips and my mouth, I make the same shape to say f and v, but they sound different. Why do they sound different? Well, one of them is voiced, one of them is not. And to make the voicing, we engage what people refer to as the vocal cords, right? Sometimes people will say the vocal folds. That will constrict the airflow a little bit to create a vibration, and that's what produces the sound. You can actually tell the difference between the voiced and the voiceless sounds by putting your hand on your throat like this. And you can actually try this for yourself. If if enough of us do it, then we won't look silly. I mean, we'll look silly, but we'll all look silly at the same time, so no one will mind. And if you say, you pronounce the letter F, you don't feel any vibration here because the sound is voiceless. But if you say then you feel that vibration right here because the sound is voiced. So you are using your vocal folds to constrict the air a little bit, so there's some vibration, and that generates the voicing in the sound. Same with s and z, right? So that's the difference between voiced and voiceless. Of course, in sounds that I can make for an extended period of time, like f and v, it's easier to tell the difference. But there are other sounds like the k sound and the g sound, where there's the same distinction, where in g there is voicing, and in k there is no voicing. In the IPA, you can, you can see here that in some cells, like this one, you have two entries. So this is the bilabial column, right? And plosive is this type of sound where you hold, you stop the flow of air completely, and then you let it go, like ba, ba, right? You close it completely, and then you let it go. That's the plosive. Sometimes that's called a stop sound because you're stopping the flow of air completely. So these are the stops or plosives. They're both bilabials, but they differ. Can you guess how these two differ? I mean, you know from hearing because we use these sounds in English, but in the way that we would describe them based on what we just talked about, how would I describe these differently? Yeah. That's right. So in the IPA, this is what's going to happen. You see the one here on this side is going to be the voiceless, and then when you have another one that's voiced. Same thing going on here with these alveolars. If you try to say t and d, notice where your tongue goes. Notice that it's pretty similar spot, right? Maybe the same spot. And that spot, you see that it says alveolar here. If you go in that little picture, you find the alveolar ridge right here. That's where you're putting your tongue to say t, right? And d. The difference is that one is voiceless and one is voiced. And then there's more than just that. There's the nasal sounds like the and the n. And there's something that we're going to see in homework 2 is that there are other ways to characterize these sounds. I won't spoil the surprise because it's going to be a whole world of, let's say, fun or discovery. Let's not say a whole world of hurt just yet, although you may perceive it that way when you're faced with it. But I don't know. It's fun stuff. It's fun stuff. So for now, let's just say if you have the sound n, right, you can say that it's voiced, alveolar, and it's nasal. Sometimes people will denote these things by writing a plus next to each of these different features. All right, this is a very brief summary of articulation as we'll see it in phonetics. If you think this is super cool and you want to find out more about articulation of human sounds and the physicality of it and the analogous issues in perception and how we perceive these sounds, I encourage you to look into phonetics and even take a phonetics class. This is stuff that is fascinating, super fun. Plus, the people who study this thing, this area here at UC Davis, are really, really good. So you definitely want to think about taking a phonetics class if this is the type of thing that, I don't know, that seems appealing to you. But for the purpose of this class, this is where we're going to leave it because this much is what you're going to need to be able to model some language phenomena, that's going to involve these descriptions of these sounds. What I need you to be able to do is figure out how to use the IPA to look at the characteristics of the different sounds. You don't need to remember which sound is which. Sometimes people have this thing, oh, I have to remember like which sound is which so I can transcribe words using IPA symbols. You don't have to do that. But you do need to be able to use the IPA chart to find the sounds you want, to find the characteristics of the sound you want. If you don't know what sound corresponds to a symbol, you can use the interactive version that's linked on Canvas in Lecture 6 to click on a symbol and hear it, right? And then one of the things that gets a little bit tricky is that then in the homework assignment, in homework 2, you're going to need to be able to take a description of a sound, figure out which sound that corresponds to, and you can use the IPA to figure that out. And you might need to use alphabet symbols, which are different from the IPA symbols, right? But if you know what the symbols are, what the sounds are in the IPA, and you know what the sounds are in the alphabet, and there's a description, right, of the alphabet in that dictionary page, then you should be able to see how these things match up. All right, before we move on to the next thing, any questions? Yeah?
How do we type IPA symbols?
That is a great question. The easiest way to figure that out is just to Google typing IPA symbols. In our computers today, it's actually possible to get an IPA font and have IPA fonts to write IPA transcriptions in your documents. Used to be that there was no easy way to do this. And that was one of the reasons people thought the alphabet was so much easier to use. And the fun thing is that if you go back like long enough, I don't know how far back you would have to go to see this type of thing. But I've definitely seen it, which kind of, I don't know, dates me. But if you look at some old papers and PhD dissertations, you could see that everything was typed except for the IPA symbols are actually handwritten. So grad students used to do this. It was to type like their whole dissertations and then leave the space where they would put the IPA symbols and they would write those by hand. So we don't need to do that anymore, but yeah, those were the days, right? And if you needed to find a paper, you had to walk to the library. Other questions? Okay, so I want to move on now from the description of these symbols and how we produce the sounds associated with these symbols to the system of sounds that are used in specific languages. So there's this distinction, right? Talking about these sounds. If you notice here, there are lots of sounds here. Not all of these are used in English. Some of these are used in English, not all of them. And then you might say, why are they even here then if they're not using? Well, because English is not the only language in the world, right? So this is meant to be the International Phonetic Alphabet. There are symbols here that will occur in some languages, but not others. The fun thing about this is that people try to come up with an inventory of symbols that would be like this limited inventory, right? So you could transcribe the sounds of the world's languages. There are thousands of languages in the world, but there's this detail to kind of get straight in our minds, right? So all of these different languages are using sounds that we can find in the IPA approximately. But different languages will use different subsets of these sounds. And one of the fun things about how different languages use different subsets of these sounds is that if we grow up speaking a particular language and we have our inventory of these sounds and we have our psychological categories for these sounds, and then we hear a different language that we are unfamiliar with and try to learn that language, getting used to the sounds that are not in our own language is one of the hardest things. A lot of people who learn English later in life have trouble with the th sounds, right? When those sounds were not present in their own languages, sometimes people will substitute the th with a s or a v or something, you know, close in some way, something that shares some of the characteristics of the sound, but it's not exactly the right sound. And when people, you know, do that systematically, we can still understand what they're saying, right? But we recognize that that sound is different. So now, like I said, I want to move on from this fun world of describing these sounds in the articulation business to thinking about specific languages and how the sounds work in specific languages. And that's when we're going to go onto phonology. So we can use something like the IPA or the CMU dictionary to represent roughly, right, not exactly, but to produce some approximation of the sounds in sequence that we'll find in some word. Right? Of course, the IPA transcription or the CMU dictionary transcription doesn't give you the actual sound, right? Because like I said, the sound is actually different every time. But it gives you kind of a rough approximation at the level of those abstract categories of the sounds, right? So we can imagine what the pronunciation is like. But even if we have these transcriptions, that doesn't actually tell us anything about the general rules of how words are pronounced in that language. Like what words are possible in a natural language and what words are not possible. Or likely, I should say likely and not likely, because when you say possible, you know, people can always find a way to come up with the weirdest sounding things. But which things sound like, you know, normal words in a language and which things sound really strange for that language. You can get a sequence of sounds that are used in a particular language and arrange them in such a way that it will not sound like something that belongs in that language. Also, this doesn't tell us, you know, how the choice of these sounds is affected by the other sounds that you see around that one sound, right? And how the sounds change depending on the other sounds around it. It doesn't tell us anything about how these sounds are going to go together. And you can imagine that there's all kinds of systematicity going on at that level. And we can model that. And sometimes people will think that as a grammar. When you say the word grammar, people imagine that it's something like don't end the sentence with the preposition, or use whom when you're talking about the object of the sentence, and who when you're talking about the subject. That's not what I mean about grammar. Grammar here, the way we're going to think of grammar, it's like the underlying rules that describe how the language works, right? What's systematic about that language. So we can think about what rules are governing the sounds, like the system of sounds in a natural language. And then we can think of something that's like a phonological grammar, right? So knowing how to describe the sounds doesn't tell us anything about the grammar of how these sounds are used. Phonology is actually going to be where we study the sound patterns in a language and how we use these patterns, the systematic organization of sounds and their relations to other sounds. And of course, the fun part about this is that even if different languages might be using very similar sounds, and we can find those sounds in the IPA, the different languages are going to have different patterns, different phonological grammars. One way to think about this is that we're going to say it's the systematic structure of speech sounds, right? So systematic is the key here, because we're going to be able to, it's something that has these underlying rules. And when I say rules, I don't mean laws. I mean, generalizations, things that we can point to say, oh, this is how it works. It doesn't mean that it doesn't mean that it's a rule that can never be broken. It's just something that explains something that you see over and over in a language, right? So we think about the systematic structure of the sounds in the language. That's what we're talking about in phonology. Our entry point into this is going to be something called phonotactics. And that right away gives you this very intuitive notion that there is something systematic about how we put these sounds together in a language. There's no language that allows us to combine any sounds that can be used in that language freely. So if you think of the sounds of a language being represented by, say, alphabet symbols, okay? So let's say that the sounds that can be used in the English language are represented by alphabet symbols. And I will say that the set of alphabet symbols is sigma in my formal language, okay? Could I say that I'm going to describe with the formal language the set of possible English strings with the formal language sigma star? So what are some alphabet symbols? So this is an alphabet symbol that corresponds to the sound T, right? This is, I don't know, an alphabet symbol, right? So if I said, I'm going to have all of the alphabet symbols, all of them, and I'm going to say that this is sigma, a set of lots of symbols that correspond to different sounds. Could I say then that the formal language that corresponds to the valid sentences in English is sigma star? What is the problem with this, or is this good? What do you think of, so this, we're going to be able to transcribe anything that somebody says in English. Right? Somebody says, I like burgers. You go and you get the symbols, you put them in order. You're going to get a sequence, a string of these symbols, right, that corresponds to the sounds, the sound of that utterance. If I say any possible English utterance, is that sigma star? Somebody's saying no, somebody's saying no. Why not? Why is sigma star not a good way to describe any possible English utterance? Yeah? Right, so let's say that these are only the ones that can be used in English. Even if all of these are used in somewhere in some English utterance. Yeah? There's rules for what should be next to each other. For example, in sigma star, we have this string, right? We have this, and we have, I don't know, we also have this string in sigma star, any possible sequences in sigma star, right? Some of these things are just not going to be plausible English utterances. Right? They're going to be sounds that we can make using the sounds that correspond to the symbols in this inventory, but you wouldn't recognize that as an English utterance. Yeah?
Do onomatopoeias count in a language?
I would say yes. Onomatopoeia can count as something that can definitely appear in an English utterance. But of course, even if you have some sounds that sound unusual, in sigma star, you're going to have things that are like a million, it's a million symbols long, right? And not something that's even physically possible to pronounce. All right? So if you think of the possible things that you could say in a language in terms of how the sounds are going to go together, the statement here is that there is no language that's going to be essentially sigma star. Here's a question for you. You see these words on the slide. You have mbaka, tselk, tagnisp. Think about which of these, read them, sound it out in your head, and think about how likely you think these would be words in English. Right? So like I said, when we say rule, a phonological rule, I don't mean to say that it's impossible, but some things just feel more likely or more frequent, right? So out of these three, who wants to guess, or your own opinion of which of these three seems more like a plausible word in English? Yeah. Tagnisp, yeah. Who thinks tagnisp is, yeah, lots of people. And then between the other two, and I would say yes, tagnisp is one that's not really breaking any rules for how we put sounds together in English. What about the other two? How do you feel about the other two? Yeah. Yeah, so sure, that's a great answer. I would say that the one that is, starts with the T, right? So you can pronounce it tselk, or you can even pronounce it selk. I meant to, when I wrote this, I was like, oh, the sound I had in mind was actually tselk with the T pronounced. Beginning a word with this sequence of sounds, t, that's not really common in English, but in the way some people pronounce certain words, that does happen sometimes. For a long time, I've always pronounced one particular word a particular way. I pronounce it tsunami. I've always, actually pronounced the T. And at some point I thought I pronounce it differently just because, I don't know, I'm not a native speaker of English, and I have some previous experience with that type of word, and that's just the way it sounds more natural to me. And then once I started noticing how people say it, lots of people do say without the initial t sound, but then I started noticing that there are several native English speakers that actually also say the t. So I wouldn't say that it's impossible to have an English word that starts with a t, but it's less common, right? So that may be breaking one of the rules of how we put the sounds together in English words. But like I said, these are not laws that can't be broken, and everybody pronounces these things differently. But even though people might have different preferences, every person is still, operating according to some version of a phonological grammar. Yeah.
So when you count things as English words, do you count borrowed words? So tsunami is like a borrowed word is definitely part of English at this point.
Yeah.
But when you're asking it as a task, which one sounds like an English word, you tend to think of maybe not borrowed words.
Right, yeah. So words that you would pronounce in a way that's decidedly an American English pronunciation. Yeah, you would be applying the English phonological rules, the English phonological grammar to pronounce those words, and that's why some of the words that we pronounce that are foreign words sound pretty different in the English pronunciation. Karaoke is one, right? I mean, sounds pretty different from the original pronunciation. Lots of French words will sound different in English pronunciation because then we are pronouncing it with the inventory of phonemes that we have in English, and we, without even thinking about it, we will apply our own phonological grammar in that pronunciation. And sometimes, we will kind of say things that we wouldn't normally say in English, but it's also not exactly how that word is pronounced in its language of origin. And then there is Mbaka, right? So starting a word with that sequence of consonant sounds would be very unusual for an English word. Is it impossible to have that in an English sentence? It is not, because there are words that people use that start like that because they are maybe proper names or something else, right? So that's not that it's impossible for us to make that sound, but we have this feeling of what feels more like the sequence of sounds that adheres to the English phonological rules, right? So we recognize tagnisp as the one that conforms the most to the English phonological rules. So that's kind of the idea of what we're talking about here. So phonotactics is the part of phonology where we're going to look at these restrictions of what sequences of symbols we can have. So when I say no English syllable is going to start with mb or t. And again, when I say that that's a rule, I don't mean an unbreakable law. I mean a generalization that describes how somebody's version of the phonological grammar is working. The thing to stress here is that I chose these sequences very intentionally because both of these are actually fairly common in other languages. So the rules of phonology are different from language to language. So here's some examples, right? This sequence of consonants, right, the st. This can appear in the beginning of English words, the middle of English words, the end of English words, right? Some examples there. So start, so that appears right in the beginning of an English word. Fast, right at the end, it can appear in the middle. And they might say, of course, those sounds go perfectly well together. I say, well, the sound s is actually not that different from the sound f, right? They share some similarities, some characteristics. But what about this, when we think of the sequence ft? You can still have it in the middle of words, like in after. You can have it at the end of words, like left. But can you think of a plausible English word that starts with ft? It has this unusual feeling, right? If we were to have an English word that starts with that sequence. That's because we have the English phonological rules baked in, and it gives us the sense for what makes an English word sound like an English word. And then there are these longer clusters, right? So the st-er, right? So that's found at the beginning of words like string, but very similar sequences will be much less acceptable, sound less acceptable to us, right? So if you start with f instead of s, so something like string, that wouldn't sound good. And then there's the interesting one. This symbol right here is the sh sound, which is actually very similar to the s sound, right? So for some people, this does not start English words. This is fine. The one with s is fine, but sh is not fine. But for some English speakers, they will pronounce a word like string with this sound in the beginning, sh. So even among native speakers of American English, there could be differences in the way we are applying these phonological rules. So here's a question for you. how can we describe these rules for what sounds like a specific language? How do we form words and letters in a specific language? If you think of these as, lots of patterns, right, that we can describe using these rules. And again, don't think of rules as laws, but as, kind of generalizations or our internal grammar. How can we describe these in a systematic and principled way, right? So that's our goal here. Not to list out these things, but to think of how can we model this in a principled way. One key for modeling this in a principled way will be to be able to take advantage of what we know about how these sounds are organized, knowing about the inventory of sounds that are going to be used in the language, and how they are organized, how they are similar or different from other sounds, will allow us to then express these patterns in a way that is, like I said, principled and systematic, right? And again, we're going to use things like the place of articulation, like which, part of your vocal tract, with articulators or vocal tract you're engaging. Whether things are voiced, whether things are nasal, and so on. All right, so that's a lot to kind of keep in mind if you are seeing this for the first time. So let's pause here and see if there are any questions. Everybody okay? Yeah.
As a linguist, which is phonologically superior, GIF or JIF?
That is a great question. GIF or GIF? In English, what would you say about these? Thinking of your own phonological grammar of English. And before you say, let me tell you, there is a right answer. Yeah.
So I was gonna say, there's two ways to answer this question. How I would say it is, some people say, or I think most commonly with the A sound following a G, I'm more used to JIF, like giraffe, for example.
Yeah.
But also there's the other way where G in GIF or JIF stands for graphics card, so that's what's good. And so I think either is fine, but in English we might lean towards JIF just for how phonotactically.
Yeah, that's lots of great ideas in there. Yeah.
I have an argument for this that I always bring up whenever this happens.
Okay.
The word gift already exists in English.
The word gift. Yeah.
Closest thing we have to it. Like I get that like giraffe, gigantic.
Giraffe, gigantic, gift. Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. So both of you had elements of the answer that I had in mind, which is both of them are fine. Both of them work in English. Now, which one should should be the correct pronunciation? That's a different question. That's not a phonological issue, right? And sometimes these things, people want there to be a correct way. With the new OpenAI models that can draw those pretty cartoons, this question came back, a very similar question, but it was not GIF and GIF, but it was a very similar question. Is it Studio Ghibli or Ghibli? And does anybody know what the answer is? There is also a correct answer here. Does anybody know if it's Studio Ghibli or Ghibli? Yeah.
Whatever Haley and Duffy allowed you to say.
Both are acceptable pronunciations. The story goes that the people who created it and worked there for a long time decided to transcribe it in Japanese characters as Ghibli. So some people feel that that's the legitimate pronunciation because that's what was intended by the people who came up with that name. But they came up with that name because they were naming it after something else that already exists in a different language. And the pronunciation in the different language, the word they're trying to get that name from, is actually the ga and not the ja. So some people say that it should be the ga pronounced Ghibli because that's where the original word is pronounced. So that's all to say it's natural language. We do whatever we want with it. If we are just using language to communicate, we're native speakers of a language, no one can tell us that what a native speaker of the language is doing is not part of that language, right? Things like, all of these rules, like I brought up before, don't end sentences with prepositions or use whom versus who. That's not what linguists spend their time trying to think about, and that's not the type of rule or law that we have in mind in linguistics. We're not trying to tell people how to say things or which sounds to use or what words to put where. We're not trying to tell people what to do. As linguists, we're interested in the science of why does it work the way it does work in the real world. When we hear people talking and using their language in the way that they do naturally, how can we explain what's going on? How can we find out how it works and why it's learned that way and why people use it that way? And then when we say rule, what we mean is, we discovered something that's systematic about the way people do this. And then we create like a rule, right? But the rule is not something that tells you how to do things. It's actually the opposite. It should tell us why you're doing it that way. Yeah?
I was also going to say, the way things are correctly pronounced is subject to change based on,
Of course, yeah.
what sounds right, which is dictated by, not the majority group, the dominant group in a given society.
Yes, definitely.
What is it? In Iran, there's a state that was originally called Fars, with a P at the beginning. But I think people who primarily speak Arabic can't pronounce the P sound at the beginning of words. So it got changed to Fars.
Right.
And so it has to kind of do with there's still people say one way or the other depending on
Yeah, and then you get Persian and Farsi, right, with the p and the f. Yeah, yeah. Yeah, great point. Yeah.
To build off of that, I think the change from Fars to Fars, one, because of Arabic speakers referring to it in such context and thing, but it doesn't have to do with the dominant thing because there was such a presence at that time, especially with language, as the Persian language wasn't really as common under Arab rule until what became the first national epic was written, if I'm correct.
All right. Anything else? Okay. So now that we're done with kind of the more intuitive, fun part of this, I'm going to tell you about a concept that some people find, I don't know, kind of difficult to grasp, but this is going to come up in our homework assignment. So I want to use the rest of the time we have today to talk about this, and I want you to be comfortable, ask your questions about what we're going to talk about next. Because, like I said, homework 2 is coming up soon, and this will be a part of it. And I want to tell you about the allophones, which is something that somebody brought up last time. And it's one of the fun things. This is actually, when you hear about this, when you get it, you're like, oh yeah, this is like a super fun thing about language that most people don't notice. But then you start to, get an even better appreciation for this business of how language, seems arbitrary, but it has like this whole, system of how things work. We talked about the phonemes before, right? And now I want to tell you about the allophones. But before I get there, I want to talk about cursive writing because, again, if we step away from sounds and think about something else entirely, like we did with the squares and the triangles, the analogy of how these things are working with something else that's not sounds might help you understand what's going on with the sounds. Let's think of the letter L in cursive writing. So at some point, I wrote this. I just used the mouse pad to write the word blue in cursive writing, right? People used to teach cursive writing in school. I think that you probably learned cursive writing in school. It's less and less important, right? Because people are using writing implements less and less. You can, type from a very early age now. But we'll still recognize this as the letter L. And now here's another word that also has the letter L. And when you look at the letter L in blue and the letter L in glue, if I ask you, are these the same letter? What would you say? Yes, they're both the letter L. But if I were to crop the L from blue and the L from glue, you would say, well, they look kind of similar, but not really identical. There are some important differences here. And then you say, yeah, but they're similar enough that we will say that these are the same letter. And then I will say, well, think about this idea of similar enough, and then let's crop out the final E there. So which one's more similar? The first two or the last two? As people who know cursive writing, the impulse is to say, clearly the first two are the same letter. They're the same size. And the last two are different letters. They're different sizes. And I know that the size makes a difference there. But that's just because how we already know that writing works, right? You could imagine some other writing system where the size is not that important, but the place where you start the letter is actually meaningful. In fact, we're considering these two to be different versions of the same letter. And these two, although they are very, very similar, to be decidedly distinct. Two different letters. Right? Why am I showing you these? Well, because the sounds work like this too. Sometimes we have two things that sound kind of different, a little bit similar but kind of different. Same situation here. But when we hear it, we'll say, yep, that's the same sound. It's the same phoneme. As a speaker of English, when you say this sound or this sound, I recognize both as the P sound. And the P is a good example because it does sound different depending on where it occurs. Then there are other sounds that are also really similar, but when we hear them, we'll say, ooh, yeah, that's definitely different phonemes. And that's what we have to kind of wrap our minds around, this idea that some things that seem similar are actually going to be the same, different ways to pronounce the same phoneme, different allophones that correspond to the same phoneme. And other things that sound different are just two different phonemes. And here's the catch. That's language dependent. Some things that I would say, these are just allophones of the same phoneme, those very same sounds could actually be considered different phonemes by speakers of a different language. Yeah.
I have some examples.
Yeah, we're going to see examples. We're going to see more details about this. Now, let's think about these two words, Tom, the proper name, and top. These are kind of similar words, right? Now, focus on the vowel sound in Tom and in top. Would you say those are the same phoneme? It's like, yeah, in Tom and in top. These are the same phoneme. They're, in fact, allophones of the same vowel sound, the same phoneme. Now, if you were to record somebody saying this and you crop out just the vowel sound, you would notice that there's actually a difference in that vowel sound. Does anybody know how those two vowels in tom and in top would differ? Yeah.
Was there some sort of co-articulation?
There is something that is related to that, but it's a specific feature of the sound. Yep.
It's voiced or not?
Vowels are always voiced. You always need voicing to produce a vowel sound. Yeah.
Is the nasalization because of the M?
One of them is nasal. If you were to crop out the vowel in tom, you will notice that there's a nasal quality to it. And that's because it's in a particular environment, right? It's right after it, there is a nasal consonant. So the vowel that we use there actually is a nasal vowel. And in top, it is not a nasal vowel. But in English, that vowel, whether it's nasal or not nasal, that's the same phoneme, just different allophones of the same phoneme. There are languages, though, where that difference, whether the vowel is nasal or not, will actually make it into two different phonemes. And how can we decide if these are two different phonemes? Because they're so similar. Here's more or less how you can do it, right? If you swap out one for the other, are you creating a different word, or are you still pronouncing the same word? So take the word top. Now, try to pronounce the word top, but with the nasal vowel. I don't even know if I can do it because I'm not good at these things, but like top, right? So that's still the word top. I'm just saying it with a nasal vowel, but it's still the same word. There are languages that if you say top, I mean, it's not exactly top, but if you take the same word and you say with the vowel that's not nasal, the oral vowel top, and you say top, people will say, oh yeah, those are different words. They mean totally different things. It's the same type of feeling we would get if you were to say rot or lot. You would say, of course, rot and lot are different. You're using different phonemes to start those words. In some languages, using the nasal or the oral vowel has that quality. But in English, these are allophones. What about these two? Pat, spat. Are these two bilabial sounds? Which one is the bilabial here? It's the p sound, right? Are these two bilabial sounds the same or different? Different. Some people are saying different. How are these different? Yeah.
So, you can go. One is aspirated and the other is.
That's right. So sometimes we don't even notice that these are different because we just use one of the variants automatically without even thinking about it because we have the phonological grammar of English baked in as English speakers. But you can actually feel the difference from the bilabial sound in pat and spat. If you put your hand right in front of your mouth and you pronounce pat, pat, when you say pat, you will feel the burst of air that you get from stopping the airflow and then starting that p sound, pat. If you pay attention, there's actually a difference in the sound. It's a p, right? There's that stronger burst of air. If you are saying spat and you put your hand there, you will feel much less of that air hitting your hand. There's actually much less of that burst that you get. So that difference, you might say how much air comes out in the stop consonant or in the plosive consonant. That doesn't make a difference. That doesn't make it into a different phoneme. That's right. We think like that in English because in English, it does not make these into different phonemes. But there are languages where the vowel that's the consonant that's not aspirated and the aspirated one are actually different phonemes. If you were to replace one for the other, you'd just be making a different word. That's another example. And then what about the difference in a bat and pat? Are those the same sound? Well, bat and pat, they're kind of similar, but as English speakers, we can clearly see that those are different phonemes because those are different words. So we can, with this in mind, we can think of the phoneme as the contrastive sound in a language, right? If you use a different phoneme, you're getting a different word. Now, if you take a word and you change one of the phonemes so that it's, you're not changing the phoneme, you just swap out a different allophone, then you would just say, that's the same word, you're just pronouncing it funny. And the allophones are going to be the different pronunciations of a phoneme. All right, so that's kind of the big concept that you need to get. And it turns out that if we look at this example right here, the pat and spat, there's actually a phonological rule that we can use that will describe when most English speakers would prefer to use the pa with no aspiration or the pa with aspiration. From what those words look like, can you guess what part of that rule might be? Yeah? There is something about the consonant that comes before. Yeah? There is something about being in the beginning. In this case here, the thing to notice is that one of them has the s sound right before it. And very often having the sound before the p sound will make it not aspirated. So it is the rule that determines which one of these you will use. That's going to be a part of your homework assignment. One of the things that's fun about this is that if you think back to the CMU dictionary transcriptions, now that you know about allophones, go in the CMU dictionary and you will notice that what you have there is the different symbols that correspond roughly to phonemes, not to the specific allophones. So in the transcription for pat and for spat, you're going to see the same symbol. You're going to see this symbol used in both situations. But I said before that one could use the CMU dictionary to create a machine that pronounces English words. But to pronounce English words in a way that will sound, acceptable to us, we should be using the different allophones in the right places. So how would a machine know by looking at the dictionary which one of these to use, the aspirated or the non-aspirated? Well, we can give it the dictionary that has the sequence of phonemes, plus some phonological rules for English pronunciation that it can use to determine which allophone to use. Does that make sense? Does that part make sense? Okay, so let's talk a little bit more about these phonological rules, and that will be the last thing for today. This is actually what I was just saying. Here are the entries for Tom and for top in the dictionary. They actually look just like that. Look at the vowel. In Tom and in top, we already determined that those vowels actually sound different. If you were to use the nasal vowel in top, then it would be tomp, which will sound odd. So how do we pick which version, which allophone of that phoneme we're going to use? How would a machine pick, right? Here's one way. We can, so the rules are actually, a little more complicated than this, but this is an approximation of a phonological rule. We're going to make the vowel nasal when it precedes, it comes right before, a nasal consonant in the same syllable. So that applies here. Each of these is just one syllable. And this vowel sound comes right before a sound that we already know to be nasal. So we're going to make the vowel nasal when it comes right before a nasal consonant in the same syllable. Here's a notation that people made up long ago. There's nothing special about this notation, but some people will still write their rules like this. It's like if you have some sound, right, you're going to get this nasal feature. And then there's a slash that tells you like when you're going to get the nasal feature. It's like if the sound is here and there's a nasal sound right after it, and then it's the end of that syllable. Here's another example. Here are the entries for lit and little. You notice that the sounds that I'm using that correspond to this symbol are actually pretty different in these two, lit, little. In little, I'm using this very different thing that doesn't sound like the t, right? It's the sound that sometimes people will refer to as the flap. If you say little, then you kind of understand why people refer to it as the flap. How do we pick which version of the sound? Or how would a machine pick, right? Well, for t and also for d, right? These are going to be flapped when they are between a stressed vowel and an unstressed vowel. So here's how we can express that as a phonological rule using that notation. If you have a sound with these features, it's a stop consonant. So it's a consonant, it's a stop, and it's alveolar. So that refers to the place of articulation, right? We're going to make that sound into the flap sound. That's represented here with this little symbol. And that happens in this environment when the sound in question is between two vowels, vowel, vowel, and this one is stressed and this one is not stressed. So we are expressing these using this notation that linguists made up long ago, and sometimes you will still find things like this. But that notation is not going to be important to us because we're going to express these phonological rules using finite state transducers. So that if you get a sequence of symbols that look like this, I want to replace this with a symbol that's more specific, that will tell me more specifically which allophone I want to use. So imagine this being the input string and the output string being a transcription that tells me which allophone I want to use. And then you can see how you could have the dictionary and a machine would still be able to pronounce things in a way that's more fine-grained than what's in the dictionary. So you would be getting two things, a list of rough pronunciations and some principles and a grammar that will give you information about how the sounds work in that particular language. And when combined, these would then allow you to pronounce the things as they're pronounced in that language. All right, that's all we have time for today. Don't forget to turn in homework 1 if you haven't yet. And be on the lookout for homework 2. That one's going to be tons of fun. I will see you next time, everybody. Bye.